You're listening to WRFR-LP 93.3 FM Rockland, broadcasting also on W257BI 99.3 Camden, and streaming online at WRFR.org. At WRFR, we're all volunteers. We invite you to join us in giving voice to the life and creativity of our Rockland-Camden area. WRFR is partnered with over 80 local businesses. Each hour, we thank 4 of these partners. Please note who they are and let them know you appreciate their support for WRFR, your local community radio station.
Good Turn Natural Foods Co-op and Cafe, cooperatively owned since 1980. A full-service community market offering organic and local foods, also bulk goods, vitamins, artisan beer and wine, fresh deli offerings daily. The Good Turn, located at 750 Main Street, Rockland.
Hello, this is Mike Hall, owner of Hall Funeral Homes and Tribute Centers. For over 50 years, Hall's has been helping families come together to honor the life of their loved one. We have convenient locations in Thomaston, Waldoboro, and Booth Bay. Hall's is a proud sponsor of Afterwards. For information on how Hall's tribute team can help you, you can call 354-6475.
Fresh, local, and organic. Eat incredibly well with a Hatchet Cove Farm CSA share. Members enjoy up to 6 months of certified organic vegetables, raw milk, local grains, cheese, and much more. Delivered to Rockland, Penn Bay Hospital, and the farm in Warren. Visit HatchetCoveFarm.com or call Reba at 712-7382.
Heavenly Threads Thrift Shop, an ever-changing selection of fine quality, gently used housewares and clothing for men, women, and children, and just about everything else. Located at 57 Elm Street in Camden, open Monday through Saturday 10 to 4. Our profits go local, donations accepted during shop hours.
And we thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about your local radio station, give us a call at 594-0721 or log into our website at wrfr.org.
Hello, Rockland. This is Gary Wheeler, your host for the next hour, and you have tuned into High Strangeness, a zone where the unbelievable is believed until proven otherwise. We mainly discuss stuff that's out there about UFOs and ETs visiting this wonderful planet of ours. And as usual, I will take callers. If anybody has anything to say about this topic or wants to express an opinion or wants to ask any questions, please feel free to call. The number is 207-593-0013. That's 593-0013. Also, I have a cell phone here that's willing to take text messages at 691-3110. That's 207-691-3110. So you can text any questions you may have if you prefer not to be heard on the radio, which is understandable. Okay, today I'm going to skip over the FYI stuff because I would like to get to the auto as quickly as possible. But first, I want to mention that this show is brought to you by Diverse Landscapes here in Rockland and Eric Best, who's an author and business consultant and good friend. You're listening again to WRFR 93.3 FM in Rockland and 99.3 in Camden, and streaming on the podcast and are available on WRFR.org. Okay, this will be probably the final show on Bob Lazar, the end of the interview with Art Bell from Coast to Coast Radio that took place back in 2002, a show that was all about secrets and the kind of work that Bob Lazar did. Lazar was a physicist who worked at a facility south of Area 51 and he claims to have worked on flying saucers. He was hired to help figure out what kind of energy system they use to make these things go. Because, as you know by now, if you listen to the show, these vehicles that are often seen can do things in the air that we can't even think about doing with our flying airplanes or whatever we put up there. Nothing like this. So he was brought there to help analyze how they were being energized, and he had decided after a few years that he should let the public know that he didn't like the fact that this was being kept so top secret. So he went out public back in the 90s, early 90s, and of course was immediately maligned by the government and told he was lying. Plus, they managed to erase his very existence when it came to any schooling he had or his working at the other facilities, nuclear facilities. So he really didn't have any way to sort of prove that his story was true. Although, for one of the labs he worked for, the phone book still had his name in it, one of the old phone books that they couldn't erase that because it was an old book. So he could prove that he did have some of the jobs he said he did. But all in all, when you listen to the man and his integrity comes through, and also his vast knowledge of the whole study that he did around these power systems that the ETs used on these craft, absolutely fascinating. I find it fascinating. So with no further ado, I'm going to continue this. This is Art Bell on Coast to Coast Radio with Bob Lazar. And we're going to resume where we left off last week, if any of you happen to recall. Okay, here we go.
You go on what?
Well, the first person I was introduced to was a guy by the name of Barry Castillo or Castillo. I don't know how you pronounce that name. But I was introduced to him. This was the guy I was going to be working with. And we had a moderate-sized lab, and specifically we were working on the power source and the propulsion system of the craft.
So he was your buddy?
He was my buddy that I was going to work with.
Uh-huh.
In the lab, the first day in the lab meeting him, he was a very down-to-earth guy, and what was there was a reactor moved from one of the craft and one of the propulsion mechanisms that were on the bench. So they had already removed something. Now, at that time, I had only seen one craft.
The one you described, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And as it turned out, there were 9 there.
9, right, and we'll get to that. But this portion of the propulsion system, or the main portion of the propulsion system, do you remember what your initial impression? Listen, by the way, I don't know if I'm gonna press you to talk about things that you are unable to. How much are you unable to talk about, or unwilling to talk about, or will get in trouble for talking about? Is there anything that you hold back that you have to hold back?
Well, the only things that there are a couple things that I haven't said, and for a reason. It's not that, there's a new news flash or something I just want to say that's new. The only reason there are some things I've held back was so I can recognize somebody from the area. Yeah, you know how all the chats and whatnot that go on the internet, they're full of just nutcases.
I know.
And on both sides of the fence, though. I mean, you have people that will swear up and down, I never lived in Los Alamos, I never worked there, or who knows what. But on the other side of the fence, you also have people that, just because they want to support me, say that, I was a security guard or something there, and I saw Bob going to work every day. Well, both of those people don't help. because neither of them are true. And as much as I appreciate the help from people that say stuff like that, it really doesn't help, because all it does is confuse matters. And, in this field of UFO research, or whatever they call it these days, is so inundated with garbage
Yep.
and just ridiculous stories, you do not need to add even 1% more, because it's impossible for anybody to take anything seriously. So there were only 22 people working there.
22.
Yeah, and I have the list of them.
You have a list of the names?
Of every person that worked there.
Oh, my
every
God.
person that had clearance for that. Now, that's the only thing I've kept to myself. There were a couple other little things here and there, and they talked me into releasing them in the movie, and that's fine. But the number one thing are the names. I mean,
The name, of course.
There's so many times you hear people say, well, I've got a friend that worked there. Really, what was his name? You know? And it's never... I've never seen a name come through.
Well, when you and your buddy first saw this propulsion stuff, how did it hit you as a physicist? What did you when you looked at it, you said to yourself, I'm looking at what?
Well, the first thing I saw that was absolutely mind-boggling, and I will never forget it, was the reactor operating. Now, this is something very small, probably on a base 12 or 15 inches square, with about a basketball size sphere on top.
Okay.
Well, semi-sphere. It's,
Right.
the basketball setting on the plate.
Right.
This was the reactor for the craft.
And
this produced a tremendous amount of energy, and also it was the source of the gravitational propulsion system, where it got its basic gravity wave from, that they amplify. Now, these are, we know what the effects of gravity are, but we cannot produce gravity or any gravity. I've spoken to a lot of people, and I ask people, that you see in NASA training films, astronauts floating around. And, that's all done in that large plane that they put into a crash dive, and people go weightless inside.
Vomit comet.
Right, the vomit comet, exactly. The majority of people I've spoken to, even people that seem fairly knowledgeable to me, think that NASA has an anti-gravity device in this room where they just turn it on and people float around. Now, if we had something like that, there wouldn't be airplanes anymore. Cars would fly. I mean, the world would be changed. We don't have a machine that can make gravity, because if you do, you can also control time. So if we had something like that, the world would be so different.
All right,
We probably wouldn't even be on the radio here. Go ahead.
This device that you just talked about, that you just described, how did you and your buddy endeavor to measure its energy output, and in what form? How did you take a look at it?
Well, like I was describing, the first time I saw it operating, all he had to do was put the lid, the semisphere, on top of this device, and it became operational. And he said, just put your hand on the top of it. Right. And when I did, I could not touch it. It was the exact sensation of taking two like pole magnets and trying to push them together.
Wow.
But it was just my hand approaching a metal sphere. Now, that in itself is shocking, because there's nothing that can do that.
In other words, you felt a repelling force, as in like a wall? I mean, you just could push on it?
I could push, starting from probably about a foot away. I could begin to feel something, and as I got closer, it got more intense, and probably at 2 to 3 inches, it was impossible to make contact with it. And you could push on the top, your hands would slide to the bottom. It was a very intense field, and you had a golf ball there, and we even something moving at high speed could not penetrate the field. This was the basic gravity wave that the system produced.
Did you determine it to be a 360-degree field?
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't?
It wasn't. And again, that's something else. It's a completely directional gravity field only on the skin of the hemisphere.
Oh, my.
And it didn't appear on the base at all. And so this alone was just absolutely mind-boggling, because here's a machine doing the impossible. The next thing that I was shown, and you know, it couldn't be a magic trick. It's my hand approaching a metal sphere. There's no room for any question there.
And what did your buddy, you and your buddy, discuss at that point? I mean, you obviously asked questions, or he offered information, or he just said...
Well, this was the initial introduction to what was going on, and I mean, you could see it in his eyes. He took pride in showing off what they had, because the next thing he showed me was connecting it to the amplifier, and he said, "You want to see something really neat now?"
Yeah?
As if that wasn't amazing. There is, how am I going to describe this? There's a fitting, almost like a pipe, that slides down and makes contact with the hemisphere.
Okay.
This apparently, from what was described to me, is a tuned pipe. Almost like
resonant.
Waveguides are tuned for microwaves to pass through.
Would be resonant.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
So once this pipe is placed upon the hemisphere, the field completely disappears. So that's giving you evidence that it's now traveling through the waveguide.
Uh-huh.
The waveguide goes to another extremely large tube, probably about 2 feet in diameter, 4 feet long, and has plates, I guess is the best way I can describe it, on the outside. This is actually the emitter, the gravity emitter. There's something in between the two, which is the actual amplifier.
Hold it right there, Bob. We're at the bottom of the hour. We'll pick it up right there. So that was the driver stage, the gravity energy driver stage for what was to come. I'm Art Bell. Once again, here's Bob Lazar. And by the way, he's not in Las Vegas anymore, I don't think. Bob, you're somewhere else now, aren't you?
The mountains of New Mexico.
Back to New Mexico, huh?
Yeah.
Cool. That's a
Literally
nice place to be, yeah. All right. What you were describing, the first thing you were describing that you saw, that was obviously a driver. Well, you know, in broadcasting, it would be the driver unit, the generator itself.
Right.
And now you're starting to describe what terrestrials would regard as waveguide or whatever carries this energy to some kind of amplifier, huh?
Exactly. However, if I can take 1 second and just step back to the hydrogen thing, the only reason I'm saying this is because, I guess because of the show.
Sure.
There are 1 million people hitting my United Nuclear website and asking me to post some kind of instructions about.
I told you.
Yeah, so I'm going to go, there's no way I can answer all the emails, so I'll go ahead and generate a web page about that. So,
well, you could either do that or give out your home phone number.
Yeah, I'd rather do the web page.
Okay.
So there'll be some information up there eventually.
Thank you.
Got to give me some time to do that.
On behalf of the millions out there. Yes.
Back to the reactor.
Right.
Or the propulsion system. Anyway, the way it was configured was supplying the basic wave, the basic gravitational wave, to the amplifier and to the emitter. In the craft, there are 3 emitters.
3.
In a triad pattern. Uh-huh. And what I found interesting is, you know, after being involved with the project, that kind of made me start looking into UFO stories to see what's true and what's not.
Yeah, sure.
And there were so many stories, especially rash of Belgian sightings in the early 90s, I think, or middle 90s, where they saw on the bottom of the craft 3 bright spots of light.
Right.
And that is exactly how this operated. Another interesting thing was, I know I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but the other craft that were there all had the same power and propulsion system in it.
All 3 emitters?
Yeah, which I found really interesting in itself, which means that whatever civilization made these, it's almost as if there's, you know, it sounds crazy, but a factory that's producing these and subbing out their propulsion systems for different models of crafts. I mean, it almost sounds like a car.
Well, that's how we'd do it.
But it was the identical system in all crafts.
All right, now he demonstrated the amplifier to you?
Yes, that was the reason he connected up the reactor.
How was the amplifier demonstrated? In other words, what further did you see when he brought the amplifier online?
When he fired that up, he took an ordinary candle and put it probably about 6 feet in back of the emitter. And I was waiting for things to get started, but he really didn't do anything, at least that I saw. And went over and looked at the candle, and the flame was no longer flickering.
Huh.
It was essentially frozen the way it was.
Frozen?
Yeah. It just, the candle was there, and the flame was like a two-dimensional picture of it.
Oh, my God.
I mean, the flame wasn't moving, but it was still emitting light.
Which means...
Well, it could mean all kinds of things. It's just another thing that is bizarre, that you really can't, I mean, how in the world would you do that?
Now, wait a minute. Now, we know, don't we, physicists know that gravity bends and affects
Oh, absolutely. I'm
light.
saying, but without using gravity, how could you do that?
You couldn't.
Yeah, exactly.
So within that field, it froze, to your eyes, it froze that image.
Right, to my eyes.
Solid.
The candle was removed, and to show me how the emitters can focus gravity, because this is very crucial to how they operate. They must be able to focus and diverge the gravitational wave.
Uh-huh.
Apparently, he set it for a tight focus and increased the power to it, and at the focal point, which was at that time probably about 3.5 to 4 feet from the rear of the emitter,
right,
a black dot formed, a black ball, not a black hole where it's going to suck in the desks and things there.
Yeah.
But what he was showing me was the fact that light was being bent. Now, there is nothing that we have that can do that.
That would have been at the focal point. Now, for example, with a satellite dish, a lot of people know about satellite dishes.
A parabolic dish.
That's right. Out at a certain point, which is the focal point, on a good dish, it's about the size of a quarter or even smaller. That's what's called the focal point, where all the energy from that satellite dish is radiated right to that little tiny spot, and that's where they put the collector, or the LNA or LNB, to get the signal. And that's a focal point. So you're saying, just like that, at the focal point, but out in the middle of nothing, in the middle of air, there was a black dot.
Right, and that he was demonstrating the fact that the device was bending light away from the area. I mean, it was a completely black dot.
Yeah.
Later to find out, well, I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but anyway, there were a couple small demonstrations like that were extremely impressive, and this is what we were supposed to be working on. And, our mission was really not just to find out how it worked, but the aim of the project was to see if these systems and subsystems can be duplicated with earthly materials.
Bob, when these engines, for lack of a better word, were running, was there any audible noise? You were there in the room. I mean, was there, other than the test of putting your hand up, was there anything that hit your sensory system that you could describe when these things were running?
On the test setup in the room, it was completely silent. I wasn't even sure if the thing was operating. However, during the test flight of the craft, with all three amplifiers operating, there was a definite hiss and corona discharge on the bottom of the craft.
A hiss?
Now, a hiss, like a high voltage hiss. If you ever been around,
yes.
High voltage power lines or, high power transmitters, you must have.
Of course.
And, you have that familiar high voltage hiss.
And you said a corona discharge.
A corona discharge, which is kind of not a St. Elmo's fire, but a blue glow that you typically see, again, around high voltage systems, and what's happening in the air is breaking down and emitting photons, and, it glows. It's the same reason why lightning bolts are visible.
Indeed.
But it was obvious there was high voltage on the skin of the craft, and obviously it was leaking off because that sound is unmistakable. As the craft lifted off higher, and approached 20 or 30 feet, the sound disappeared, so it was obviously interacting with the ground.
Fascinating.
So just in free flight, there'd be no sound at all.
Now, do you know, you say there were 3 emitters on each craft. Do you know offhand how these emitters in flight were manipulated to, for example, leave the ground and then begin propulsion that would take you horizontal or vertical or wherever you wanted to go. Do you know how that energy was manipulated?
Yeah. The craft operate in two modes. It's Omicron and Delta. Omicron is using a single amplifier to move the craft, and Delta uses all three amplifiers. Whenever a craft is near another gravitational source, such as a planet or whatever, it's only using one amplifier to lift itself off the ground. The amplifiers are these, like I said, or I keep using the word amplifier, the emitters are these 4-foot-long, 2-foot diameter pieces of pipe, essentially, held by a 2 or 2.5-foot, 3-inch diameter flexible pipe. And these hang in the bottom of the craft. One of them points down, and it produces a gravitational wave that will lift the craft off the ground. The other two are swung almost horizontally. So in the bottom of the craft, they're really pointing out in front of it.
Gotcha.
Now, most vehicles and aircraft that we're used to either accelerate hot gas out the back or use a propeller and, throw air out the back and the craft moves forward.
Sure.
These do the exact opposite. And my best analogy for it is the old rubber sheet or the bed. If you take a bowling ball and stick it in the middle of your bed, and in front of the bowling ball, about 2 feet, take your fist and just push it deep into the bed, what happens? The bowling ball rolls forward.
Absolutely.
So this is exactly what they're doing. The craft is standing using one gravity emitter, standing on a gravitational wave, and they're using the other two essentially to make a little divot, a gravity well in front of the craft.
I understand.
And it rolls forward. And it's why they look so ridiculous when they're in that low-speed mode, because it's an unstable form of flight.
Well, that was going to be my question. When they do the vertical lift, I wonder how, of course I don't understand how that energy is distributed, but I wonder how the craft is stable as it goes vertical.
Well, the gravitational wave is propagating from the emitter, not in a linear fashion, but it's diverging. So it's on a pedestal, almost like a pyramid.
Oh,
so the bottom is so stable.
Yeah.
In fact, as it goes higher, because the area of the base increases, it becomes more stable. It's only when it's very close to the ground that it's wobbly and kind of goofy looking for such an advanced machine.
No, I've got it. And look, people should understand that not just your word tonight, but thousands and thousands of people have gone to, as close as they can get to Area 51, and they have seen, there's 1 million eyewitnesses that have seen craft being tested over those years, so there are a lot of witnesses to what you're saying right now about how they flew.
I had, if you remember at the time, I had the test flight schedule, and I brought, when I started to leak some information, I brought my friends out there at night. John Lear was one of the first people out there, and, we brought a big 10-inch Celestron telescope. And, at that time, you could get a hell of a lot closer to Area 51 than you can now.
Yes, I know.
And, we all saw what was going on.
I am curious about this. Let me ask. You obviously had been treated to plenty of security warnings, probably had to sign a bunch of crap. And so you made some kind of decision at some point to begin leaking stuff. Describe to me how you went through that metamorphosis. How did you get there?
Well, I was perfectly content with the way things were going. Once you're on the inside, it's a different state of mind. And, if you're on the outside of something, hey, it's not fair, we all should have this information, so on and so forth. But, you get kind of a change of attitude. Once you become privy to the information, you go, those guys don't deserve to know anyway. But that does change after a while. And the impetus really had nothing to do with me initially. Remember, they were still going through all my security whatnot, whatever they do to.
It goes on.
Yeah, I mean they do everything, and they're very concerned about your mental state, because that, you know, if a person is very depressed or despondent or something like that, it's going to affect their work performance, and especially if they're trusting them with very important secrets, there's going to be a problem.
National security.
Exactly. And now I had given a written order to have my phone monitored and myself monitored.
God, that's something to give. I mean, I know you're a pretty private person, but to give.
But I was excited to work on this. That was nothing.
More exciting than being monitored.
Oh, by far. And I was absolutely following the rules. You know, at the time I was married, and I wasn't saying anything to my wife. And initially, this is where the problem began. And, you know, I mean, what do you say? You leave the house at 11 o'clock at night. Where are you going? Oh, I'm going to work.
Yeah,
really?
Gary Wheeler, and you're listening to the show High Strangeness. And this is an interview between Art Bell and Bob Lazar. And this concerns his experiences working on a facility south of Groom Lake on discs that were believed to be flying saucers, and it proved to be they were. So fascinating technical information about how these flying discs are powered. Again, to remind you, you're listening to WRFR 93.3 FM in Rockland and 99.3 in Camden, and streaming on WRFR.org, where there's also podcasts available. And this particular show is archived, so you can listen to past shows by clicking on a link. Okay, back to this.
And, you know, night after, and then you come home, you know, 6-7 hours later. Where were you? I was at work.
At work.
Yeah, and, you know, after a while, it begins to sound like you're having an affair.
Yeah, of course.
Well, that's exactly
what happened.
That's exactly what happened. And
oh, brother.
As time went on, my wife began to have an affair. And they knew it, and I didn't, because they monitored the phone.
This is all new stuff. I've never heard any of this.
So they had all the written transcripts of what was going on.
Oh, my God.
And they stopped calling me out to work because they had to make a decision on what to do. They were either going to just let it sit and, you know, see what happened, you know, if we broke up or, you know, that ended or whatever.
But at any rate, you were suddenly a risk.
Yeah, and, you know, at that time, they had stopped calling me out, and I kind of began to get a little concerned, and this is when I had the flight schedule and brought a few of my friends out at the time, including my wife, and, you know, showed them what I was doing at night.
Oh.
And they all saw that,
oh.
And in fact, you know, we got away with it the first night, and we got a little greedy and went a couple other times. And we finally got caught. And, you know,
how many of you got caught, and what happened?
I think it was 4 of us. And we were standing there, you know, out close to Area 51 in the absolute black desert where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Yeah. Now, we had been staying there about half an hour, and my friend Gene and I were sitting there joking about, well, maybe we should just take the base by force, and, you know, just saying ridiculous things like that.
Yeah.
Now, little did we know that the security guys had snuck up on us, and they were no more than 6 feet from our noses.
Listening to you say things like, hey,
right, and they had no idea what was going on. So we're sitting there talking, and out of nowhere, a sniper, not a sniper scope, a night vision scope, falls on the ground. We see this little green light fall down and roll. And it came out of nowhere. You know, and we had no idea. Anyway, the guy had dropped it. Yeah. So, you know, they walked forward and, you know, made everyone go back up to the road. They call in the sheriff. And
would these have been the Wackenhut security people?
As far as I know. I had taken off into the desert because we had all assumed if I was caught, there was a problem.
Well, that's a good assumption.
Because, you know, these guys could have just wandered out there and been looking what's going on. But if they saw somebody from the inside there. So I took, well, I'm not even going to say that. I took off into the desert. And They had counted how many people were there.
Toward or away from the area?
Away from the area.
Away from the area.
Out into the desert, and
Just trying to get
they
away.
saw there were 3 or 4 people there, and then when we got back up to the road, and the sheriff came out from there, I think his name was La Moreau, who's still around there, and that's when I reemerged, and he said, wait, we got a discrepancy, there's an extra person here. Well, what's his name? And he took my license, read it into the base, and, he said, okay, well, everybody can go. And the following day I was called for a debriefing down at Indian Springs Air Force Base, which I had never been to before.
They didn't, that's very interesting. They didn't throw you in jail. A lot of people...
No, they didn't do anything.
They spend the night in jail, a lot of them.
No, the second they heard my name, the second he read the license, they said, let everybody go. And it was the following day when I got called in, and Dennis, who was the security supervisor at the time, drove to my house, and we went down there in my car, and that's when it really hit the fan. And, kind of to make a long story short, they were pissed, to say the least. And
well, don't make it too short. This is pretty interesting stuff. I'd actually like to get some details of that. You called it a debriefing. Probably it was more like a let's see how scared we can get this guy.
Well, that's exactly what it was.
All right, then hold on to that thought, and we'll be right back. Indeed, just over the mountain from me, a place called Indian Springs, and there is an Air Force base there, and that's where they called you, Bob?
Right.
Summoned you, said you, would you get one of the calls? It's now noon, you will be, you'll be up here at some certain time, or what?
This was a little different. This Dennis called me, who was my security supervisor at the time, called me personally and came to my house, which was very unusual.
Oh.
And then we both drove down in the same car to Indian Springs, which is an auxiliary Air Force base in this little town, which is, the base is essentially shut down. But I guess some of it, remains operational. In any case, that's where they took me.
Uh-huh. And
that's when they started the debriefing. The first thing they brought up was, of course, that, tremendous breach in security, and they wanted to know everybody that I had told anything to, why I went ahead and did it, and, I was pretty straightforward with them, but they tried to be as intimidating as possible, and
were you threatened outright?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, and so was my wife's life. So I became very concerned about that.
Do you care? Do you actually care to tell us what they said to you? I mean, did they say, you'll end up a lump in the desert like so many others, or
there was a lot of fear present at the time, and I don't remember verbatim, what tagline they used, but it did get my attention.
Yeah.
And this is when they brought up the transcripts of my wife's affair on the phone.
Oh, that they told you?
Yeah, so I found out from them.
At that moment?
Yeah, at that moment.
Wonderful.
This was something they had to slap in my face.
Gee whiz, I wonder why they picked that moment to tell you.
Well, who knows? But anyway, that's how the separation between us really came about. It was because of that, because of, bringing my friends out there to see what was going on, and, all the, yeah. So that's really what set everything in motion.
All right. A lot of stories have flown around about what happened, Bob, after that. For example, we have the mutual friend of John Lear, who now, by the way, doesn't talk about any of this anymore, doesn't want any publicity. You can't blame him. He's lost some jobs. He's back working. He's doing fine, and he just doesn't want to talk about this anymore, and I don't blame him. Do you?
No. I think John's rave now is about the dump up there at Yucca Mountain.
Yeah.
About the nuke waste dump. And,
sure.
It's the one thing I agree with John Lear is, I know everyone in Las Vegas doesn't want it there, but if you're going to put it anywhere in the country, why not put it where you've already exploded 100 atomic bombs? It's already a wasteland, at that part of the test site, so.
Well, you're
Anyway,
right. That's a big controversy. Anyway, listen, there was a big controversy about something called element 115, which was said to be some kind of fuel, an element we don't have now on Earth, that was the fuel or the what? What can you do?
Well, I guess you could call it a fuel. It's what made the reactor operate. And it's a super heavy element, something that we've theorized can exist. People think back about, high school or college chemistry. You recall that as the elements get heavier, once you pass uranium, they decay. And some decay very fast. As the elements get very heavy, their half-lives become extremely short, sometimes microseconds. So they're just around, they exist just for a blink of an eye. Well, it's been theorized, and has been some time ago, that there are islands of stability. Somewhere higher up in the periodic chart, there are places where groups of elements would again become stable. And this occurs, what theoretically was to occur in the 114, 115 area, and again
an island of stability.
Right, where these elements are relatively stable. And again, there is supposed to be another island of stability somewhere up in the 200s. But these are unattainable things, and no one says that nature has ever produced them, except
at
maybe
the moment. But when you talked about element 115 years ago, so many years ago, since then, interestingly, we progressed to the impossible. In other words, since you actually talked about it, they've been discovering elements moving up, right on up the chart.
Oh, they're getting close.
Yeah, they're getting very close.
They're getting close, and the half-lives are getting longer.
Yeah, I know. People back then hoo-hawed at this, but now they're not hoo-hawing so hard anymore because we're getting pretty close.
Right. And I'm sure eventually they'll synthesize it somehow. They use, instead of bombarding it with neutrons now, they use this new fusion technique where they fuse the nuclei of two other elements together, which is kind of an odd way to do it, but it's got, I think the Lab for Heavy Ion Research in Darmstadt, Germany, has pioneered most of the new heavy elements. And, mark my words, they're going to be the guys that synthesize 115.
Huh. Bob, there was talk that you spirited some element 115 out of S4. Is that true?
Where'd you hear that, Art?
Oh, I got friends too, Do you want to say no?
Comment about
you don't want to comment on that?
No, I don't want to comment about that. But it's that would be a good sledgehammer.
All right. Well, we'll just we'll leave that one alone, I guess. Do you think that since the time that and you know what we didn't cover, we missed it. You described the one craft, but at one point while you were there, you saw a total of what? Would you say 9 craft?
9 craft.
9 craft, and
if I recall, that was the day Barry and I were working in the lab, and Dennis came in and he said, "Come on out. There's a test flight." So there was a flight scheduled, and they were allowing me to see it. And we went from the lab out into the first hangar, which was the only one I ever saw open. And as I went out there, the craft was already outside the hangar and sitting on the ground. I don't know if they rolled it out, it flew out, or whatever.
Right.
But as I was walking through the empty hangar, I looked to the right, and there were big bay doors in between the hangars, and they were all open. And I could see all the craft lined up. So they had an outright collection of these things. Anyway, the craft was outside, and there was a guy sitting near the door with what I surmised was an ordinary VHF radio, and this is something that to this day really bothers me, because it should be, if this is a gravity-propelled craft, which is bending and distorting all forms of electromagnetic radiation around it and whatnot, it should be impossible to communicate with the thing.
The radio should
through
have
a VHF radio.
It should have been trash, yeah.
But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it just looked that way to me, and it was something more advanced. But anyway, he was apparently in communication with somebody in the craft, so I know it wasn't being flown remotely. And anyway, that was the first time I got to see, and the only time, all the crafts inside the hangar.
Did you ever get to see the inside of any of the craft?
Yeah, just the one. The one I coined the term the sport model, because it, in comparison to the other crafts, it was really sleek and thin and looked like a sporty version.
Can you describe the inside? I mean, did it seem as though it was designed for, say, a human or something close to a human?
Well, it's hard to say. It was designed for something small, because certainly a 5.5 or 6 foot person is hunched over in all but the very center of the craft. It's an uncomfortable setup. It's extremely barren. There are 3 seats in there.
3.
Yeah, and there is. It's all one color. There are no aesthetics anywhere, and as far as the placement of everything, there are no sharp corners anywhere. Imagine taking a seat. The amplifiers looked like tables or boxes, just to give you a simple figure idea. But it was as if the inside of the craft was all molded with these parts out of wax.
Molded. In other words, in aircraft, we have rivets, we have various forms.
Everything flowed together as if it was made out of wax and heated and then cooled. So there were no sharp corners. Everything just kind of blended together like the entire thing was injection molded. There was no visible seam or right angle anywhere. And everything was just a dull, pewter's a little dark, but a dull aluminum color. So just being in the place, it looked very unearthly, if I could use that term.
Sure.
It was very unusual, because in any place you've ever been and anything you've ever looked at, there are varying colors, shapes, and sharp corners. And everything was rounded, and everything was monochromatic. It was just one color.
What about apparent controls for control of the craft?
There were none.
There were none?
There were none.
That's really interesting.
There were no buttons, lights, or navigator position or anything of that sort of the 2 places I was allowed to look at in the craft. Now, obviously, whoever piloted the craft was on the central level. The level immediately below it, there's a small access hatch with a collapsible honeycomb access way. And I stuck the upper part of my body in there kind of upside down, and I was told to do that so I can see the placement of the gravity emitters and how they're hung and how they move.
Oh, yes.
And so that was the bottom level. Underneath that was just the skin of the craft. Now, above that, I was not allowed to venture. There was a small area above it, and on this particular craft, the hump on the top, or the dome on the saucer, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
It's not round. It's kind of flat on the top. There were these black portals. I believe there were 4, if I remember correctly. And there weren't windows. They were, from what I surmise, is they were some sort of planar sensor, so the craft could get its orientation in space or wherever it was, where it could, these would detect positions of stars or something like that, so it can get a fix on its orientation and where it is, where it's going, and that sort of thing. Now, that's my guess.
So,
I have no idea.
But you surmise that there probably was an area of some control that you didn't get to see.
Well, either that or there is a different type of control.
Yeah,
that has no obvious, buttons or knobs or anything.
Well, I know now, even in our fighter jets, they're beginning to get to the point where they put on helmets and they can actually think commands. I mean, we're doing that here on Earth.
Yeah, it's not out of the realm of possibility that the craft would operate that way. How we interfaced to it, I would love to know. Because if, in fact, it did work that way, using an alien creature's mind, who in the world came up with the interface? And what would you have to go by? So there's so much information I would have loved to have known to complete the picture for me.
But you would surmise from what you did see that these craft were probably made for creatures that would be, on average, much smaller than humans.
They would have to be. They would have to be almost close to half our size to comfortably fit in there.
Huh. Now, you never, ever saw any alien beings.
No.
Were there, between you and your buddy or anybody else that you ever talked to up at S4, were there any discussions of beings? I mean, it would be, how would there not be discussion of who
there was about who piloted the craft, and they called them the kids. That was the term they coined.
The kids.
The kids. And that's probably because of their size or who knows what. But that's it.
That's pretty interesting, though. They called them the kids.
And actually, everything looked like it was set up for a child. So maybe that's where it came from.
Bob, but how far since you have left, which is a lot of years now, do you think, for example, when you were there, how much progress had actually been made in either duplicating or beginning to get a handle on how these generators operated and the beginnings of duplication or trying to duplicate what they were doing?
Well, I don't think they got very far. I use this analogy probably the last time I was on your show, and, if you took an ordinary modern-day motorcycle and just transported it back in time to the 1800s, to the wagon train days, and just left it out front. In the morning, everybody woke up and discovered it there with the keys in it. Now they can poke around and prod with it and play with it, and eventually they're going to figure out how to start it just out of sheer luck. And it's going to start and it's going to run, and they'll be proficient at driving it as long as they keep playing with it. And when it runs out of gas...
After crashing quite a few times.
Well, yeah, but they'll pick it up, and they're pretty tough, and, go on. And when it runs out of gas, it'll never work again. It'll sit there.
Yeah.
And, however, when it comes to duplicating it, if they wanted to make one, they couldn't even make the plastic fender on the thing because that material is just amazing to them. Right? I mean,
that's
polypropylene or something like that. They just look at it and go, wow, it's solid, but it bends and it melts. And, they couldn't even make a fender or a turn signal on the thing.
Much less the engine or the...
Oh, forget about the working part. But this is exactly where we're at. We got a really cool toy, and we've played around with it enough to where we know how it works, and we can make it move around. But when the fuel runs out, or something else happens to the craft, that's it.
Then you've just got an inert piece of stuff that you never figured out.
Right. I don't think they're ever going to duplicate, in our lifetimes anyway, what's there. They may use it and may get some other information off of it. Now, again, I'm going on thoughts that are 12 years old, so they could have made some tremendous strides since I was gone. And I was certainly not privy to all the information, but that's the impression that I was left with.
All right. Hold tight, Bob. We're at the bottom of the hour here, actually. All right. Once again, here's Bob Lazar. Bob, an obvious question, and one coming from Madison, Wisconsin on my computer is, were there any signs on any of the craft of obvious damage?
Not on the craft that I worked on at all. And, everybody's wanted to know, well, how did we get them?
Sure.
And, that's information I wasn't privy to. I would love to know, too. Was this, you hear so many stories in UFO lore about an alleged exchange of technology. Did this actually occur? And I've heard people say, well, we know there are crash retrievals. We have inside information. And you can't tell me that somebody came from 30 light years and 9 different advanced craft and they all crashed. It's not possible. So, I could certainly see the Roswell crash occurring, but I just don't believe that flying saucers come here from a tremendous difference and they just miscalculate the weather conditions and they wind up crashing all over the place. It doesn't make any sense.
I hear you. What about, did you ever learn anything of the material that the craft were made of? In other words, Could you take a blowtorch and cut? Could you damage, dent, or otherwise bend, spindle, or mutilate the material the craft was made of at all?
I don't know. Again, that was compartmentalized. That's the metallurgy guys that got to play with that. The only contact I ever had was going in the craft, and then the first day walking by it, I stuck my hand out and slid it along the craft, and it just felt cold, so I assume it's metal. But it certainly could have been an advanced ceramic or some other unknown material. But
it kind of felt like metal, though.
Yeah, it was. Metal has that, cold feeling to it. The surface didn't feel exceptionally smooth. It was aluminum is the only thing that comes to mind. Just unfinished aluminum. But I doubt it was actually that. But
do you think was there any sense of weight? In other words, did you ever have an opportunity to see anybody attempting to lift or move any of these craft, getting an idea of the kind of weight they were trying to move?
No, I didn't. The only thing that caught my eye in relation to weight was above the craft, in the hangar, there was one of those suspension cranes with a hook on it. And it was rated at 10 tons because they had that in big, bold lettering on the side. So that makes me think, well, if they in fact use that to move the craft, it weighs less than 10 tons.
Huh.
That's about as far as I can go on that. But I've heard people make comments that, actually they only weigh a few pounds. But I don't think that could possibly be true. Number one is, at different times moving into the craft, you're sitting on the extreme edge of it, and it would certainly teeter, plus the amount of equipment they had moved into the craft, lights and whatnot, for investigation of it. It makes me think it's something of some pretty sizable weight. It's not, it's certainly not a flyweight piece of material.
Bob, a lot of the interesting news stories I get about world affairs and maybe wars between India and Pakistan, all the rest of it, they come from the United Kingdom, which I think is embarrassing. It annoys me that I've got to get to news I can't get here from the UK. Your movie is going to be made in the United Kingdom. Are you going to have any input at all during the
Okay, I'm going to interrupt there. It's almost the end of the show time, and pretty amazing stuff as far as I'm concerned. And they mentioned his movie. Of course, this was recorded in 2002, and it sounds as though they were going to make it very quickly, but from what I've read recently and saw on the internet, somebody's trying to crowdfund money to make the movie. So I doubt if it's Bob Lazar, because he didn't seem all that interested in the commercial aspect of any of this stuff. So I think he just went back and is doing his normal business that he does in science. So I'm not sure what's going to happen with the movie. That audio is just about finished. There's maybe another 10 to 15 minutes, which I'll finish up next week. And that's going to be all for today. As normal, I want to wish you a good week, and remember to embrace the mystery, and especially embrace the mystery that is you. So next week I shall be here as well. Hopefully you will too. Till then, bye-bye.